So the next and final presentation in this session is Canalizing Babbling, development-inspired goal sampling for Visuo-Motor learning. And the speaker is Marco Gabriele Fedozzi from the Italian Institute of Technology. And the floor is yours.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
So
let's welcome the speaker.
I'll start with a question, which is, why do babies learn? Like, I know it's a bold question, like, it's an assumption, of course, but like, why? I've ever stopped it, like, why don't we just like have all the knowledge we need, you know, from the get-go? And I'll be more specific, because that seems quite a complex topic. Let's see, why don't we learn how to, why do we know already how to move, how to coordinate? I mean, there are plenty of animals that are very adapted moving early on after birth, while we take months and months and months just to know how to crawl and stumble around in the environment. And I think that it might be interesting, especially now that we're starting to look on how to replicate that on these big, chunky metal machines, okay, to figure out like what's the difference, okay? Why do we really need that much time? And is there something beyond just being very complex into that? If you think about how we're doing like the visual motor coordination nowadays with robots, the most promising approach you probably saw was the visual language models. Okay, so big data cluster that just train and train and train and train. And at some point, you have some coordination there. However, I'd like to step in and think about the fact that this is not really a learning agent. Okay, so this is a shippable product. You train and train and train, and then you have something that works well out of the box. Might have some generalization that really depends on the data, on how you train, for how long you train. But babies are quite different from that. Babies learn not to really move, but they learn to place goals, to set themselves up for obstacles that they will then learn how to achieve. And I think that this learning to place goals and to achieve them is probably the most important fact of how we manage to become, to adapt and managing the complex environment around us. And among all the goal-directed actions that we can do, I think one of the most explicit in its potential for learning is the reaching one. So how do we come from nothing and just stumbling about to learn that we want to reach for objects, and that's interesting, and that helps us down the line. So how do we do that? How do we arrive at that point? I will not go into too much details about the learning stages, because we have Daniela Corbetta in the audience, which is quite well more versed than me on this. But we can, let's say, split the development into 3 phases, from 0 to reaching, which is the reflex phase, in which baby do very stereotypical movements, up until a development phase in which we see the different dynamics, so vision and motor instead, seems to learn in parallel to a degree. And then we arrive at the reaching certain point. And for now, I want to stress a bit more the importance of what I think is the importance of reflexes, because they're often overlooked. We see most reflexes are the feeding reflex, the orienting reflex, so survival-based. But we have more reflexes, more almost goal-oriented in a sense. For example, if we think of the pre-reaching reflex, in which babies flail their arms more toward interesting objects, let's call them objects in the scene, than just at random. And the question was, why is it there? Like, is it just a byproduct of evolution, or is there something beyond? And that made me think about canalization. So if you're not familiar, canalization is a process that we see in many animals in which an action gets executed from birth, for example, in ducklings, in which they start vocalizing, and their own voices gets picked up by their hearing system. And what it does is that it fine-tunes the parameters into recognizing the specific call of their own species. So these stereotypical action leads to one observation, then in turn fine-tunes, let's say, your sensorimotor feedback. And can we say that reflexes do something similar for us, for babies, and potentially then for robots? So can we say that reflexes are sort of canalizing behavior that leads to more interesting observation, and interesting here being more multimodal, complex, and coordinated. And so for that reason, the question was, how do we actually test that? No. And we can't really do much with babies. It's hard to remove the confounding factors. But luckily, as we've seen for like the 10th time, this ICDL, we have plenty of simulators, among which MIMo. So why MIMo? You already know, of course. It's fun, it's nice looking, sure, but it's also multimodal, has a full body control, and is like really well versed for reinforcement learning, which is what we might like to end up doing down the line. What we're trying to do is actually, like very simply put, a data collection, right? So we have a fixed policy, we collect some data, and then we see what we can do with that data. Let's call them experiences. This policy, well, it's the canalizing behavior that I was talking before. It's, again, quite simply put, just a visual observation of the scene, finding what's interest, and then finding what's interesting in the point, in the 3D space around us, and then trying to move, flail, and orient our gaze towards that. Again, talking about the pre-reaching reflex. A quick overlook of like how are we doing that. So the saliency, I will not go into super details, but of course, feel free to ask me later. Is just imagine a classic computer vision pipeline. So here for now, the only, let's call it biologically inspired way of doing that is an inspiration from the visualsaliency hypothesis. So we have filtering, chroma filtering, orientation filtering, motion filtering across different scales. We put them together, and then we find let's say, with a softmax, the probably most salient point in the space around. As for the control, instead, well, I'm a roboticist, probably many of you are, and inverse dynamic is the easiest way to move something, okay? If you're not aiming for now to learn how to do that in a biologically inspired way. And that's how we do. So just, once I found the point, just make the agent look and let's say, orient the hand and reach for the interesting point in space. And now, since we're looking for collecting visual observation, we also have to have interesting scenes, so more complex than just a standard one. Again, I'll skip the details because Francesco already mentioned that yesterday, and if you missed the talk, too bad. It was very good. You should not do that next time. The observations themselves, okay, we collect binocular vision, haptic information, and proprioception. For those nerds interested, it's all in torch reinforcement learning, which is very fun. If you have questions, I love that. Just come to me later. But does it matter? Like, does it actually achieve something? Well, the best way to test that would be to have these two data collection, right? And then to train the full system, multimodal visual-motor coordination system to achieve reaching. Well, that's long, and that's probably like my PhD thesis. So what we can do for now is just look at the features, of the different type of experiences collected. So the simplest proxy we can find for that is it's the distance between the hand and the optical axis, where you're looking at, okay, in space. And that gives us an information on how close are the hands, how often the hands are in the field of view, if you want, which should lead to more, interesting coordinated visual motor observation. Because if you see your hand, well, you kind of know more of like where your body is, right? So for doing that, we compare the canalizing version, so the process I told before, the policy, with just random targets that are disjoint between heads, like eyes, hands, and also mixing one and just random motor, okay? We have a bunch of tests with different parameters for strength, coordination, yada, 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 like a lot of them. And so does it actually work? Well, yes. We can see from here that both in a canalizing and in a mixing being I have some canalizing and some random targets, the mean distance of the hand is lower than in the case in which you have just random targets. So although the control is the same, forcing for this coordination and for the targets being the salient one, not just random point, but the salient vision point, the distance of the hands from the visual axis is lower. So we assume we have better, more interesting observation that will lead to an easier coordination while we'll learn that down the line. And with that said, that's all for me for now. Expect more, hopefully, in the next year in SCDL. And I'd like to thank you all for your attention. Thank all my supervisor and Professor Jochen Triesch, for which I conduct my research. And for any question, I'm here. Scan the QR code. Find me somewhere on what social media. And thank you again.
Thank you very much, Marco. Any questions? We have one up there.
Yes.
At the end. Any other?
Hi.
Hi.
Thank you. You say you're a roboticist?
I do, yes, actually, yes.
And I think your modeling would benefit massively from taking an embodied and an active perspective.
Yeah.
Already 30 years ago, we published in Science about the functional significance of early arm movements in neonates. And it turns out that they by waving their arms around their heads in view, they are learning about their own hands, that they are not simply objects, but that they can be used to touch all sorts of interesting objects in the environment. And they learn to perceive the environment in terms of their own arm length and in terms of the size of their hands, as graspable or not graspable, as within reach or out of reach. And so it's not, our early arm movements are not transforming from primitive reflexes that are unintentional, involuntary, and just excited waving of the arms into voluntary, meaningful reaching and grasping. It's from birth they're learning about, and probably already when they still were a fetus, they're learning about the proprioceptive feeling of moving their arms around, and they're incorporating their arms into their bodily frame of reference. And if they had been born with wings, then they would be incorporating their wings into their bodily frame of reference. And it massively affects what they can do with what action capabilities they have in the end. So, I think you should read up on embodied cognition.
Thank you so much. I'm pleased to see that I did, actually. And that's why this is the first phase of a longer project. So these, let's call it data collection, this is a very partial view. At the same time, there's actually some learning, of the state. And that's why you also have haptic feedback, proprioceptive feedback. So with even this very simple, and here I'm talking the first days, so this is modeling the very first days after birth. And we can discuss whether there is intentionality at this stage and what we mean with intentionality, or if just this elicited motion then leads to an understanding of, as you said, what I can reach, what I can grasp, that then closes the loop on, once I got there, by any means, intentionality or not, now I know I can do that, I can manipulate that, I can touch that. And in that case, in, again, later stages, when there's the actual, let's call it learning, in that stage, I already have that experience, which again, might come from intentionality, might come from reflexes. For now, we can't really test how deep of a desire to move that is versus, there's some feedback loop that generates action that then in turn are interesting. And so there are, the propagation of the feedback for that, I suppose. So my assumption here is that, let's say there are reflexes for, again, the first 9 days or something. And if that's the case, and we have learning down the line, does it help? Of course, the super interesting thing to do will be to, let's keep the reflexes, right? Let's say we have learning of the policy to act from the get-go. Is that better than having this data collection, biasing, if you want, before? Is it better? Is it different? And I think like this is like MIMo, for example, allows us to test these two hypotheses. Like,
I just think that if
let's
you try to
close this to
explain-
this question from the speaker
we'll
for the
talk later,
audience, so that we can reflect on this during the coffee break and hopefully have more interesting discussion. Thank you so much.
thank you.